Realm presents Born to the Blade, Episode 8.
Prologue. The raft swayed almost at Mist's level. The shards and pebbles of airstone studded into its lashed-together wood frame were barely enough to keep it in flight, and the teenage navigator was so exhausted they could barely manipulate their blade. Their russet head dipped with exhaustion, and the raft dipped too, but the people on board were too worn out even to gasp. The navigator recovered their wits and cut a quick sigil of loftiness, bringing the raft briefly higher, but it was clear they were almost at the end of their strength. Then something did awaken the drained emotions of the passengers. A cry went up, first at the front of the raft, then traveling across the dozens of crowded families. The navigator raised their bloodshot eyes and saw, rising in front of them, the unmistakable tiered islands of Toifé. The mists around Toifé were notoriously treacherous. The navigator gazed doubtfully at their shaking hands, then made a decision and carved the fire flower sigil, adjusting it to communicate a stylized maelstrom, the traditional distress signal. With the last of their energy, they added a second burst of sparkling light above the foundering raft, this in the shape of the Rumican Chimera. For what felt like dozens of minutes, they drifted. The navigator felt their extremities going cold with exhaustion. Then, once more, a cry went up from the front of the raft, and on the next surge of current, a ship, no, 3, appeared from the direction of the islands. They were small airships for fishing close to harbor, but the fisherfolk were skilled navigators and made straight for the raft, slinging out ropes to drag it into port. As soon as the raft was secured, the navigator let themselves drift into a semi-conscious state. They roused slightly as they were being helped off the raft and onto solid landmass, enough to note that the rescuers were a mix of Rumicans and others. They were heaved onto a cart with other passengers from the raft and drawn through lanes that seemed impossibly narrow, between buildings rising like small cliffs. By the time the cart reached the warehouse that had been repurposed as an emergency shelter area, the navigator was once again unconscious. "Will she survive?" asked Miho, a young woman stirring a vat of tea over a fire in a corner. "They," answered her Rumican colleague. "They are just exhausted. They should be all right with rest. Still, we had better call a healer to be sure. Do you know any?" "Of course," answered Miho with a wink. "We Zenatai are the best healers. Try asking Takara no Yuki over there." She pointed out an aged woman making the rounds of the refugees with a pull cart of broth and poultices. "And now," she added, "I'll be off. I've got to get to work." She relinquished her ladle and untied her apron. "I'll try to come back later." "You've already helped a lot," her Rumican friend told her. "Thank you." The Zanatan shook her head. "We, too, know what it is to lose our land to the Kuloi." Miho grasped her colleague's hand, then set off through the streets of Lois Toifé. She took the lift to the top level, then followed her usual route through the much wider, cleaner, and well-lit boulevards of that island. Miho let herself in through the servants' entrance in the back of the circle and changed into the uniform she was required to wear at her job. Once dressed for work, she took her instructions from the duty steward and set about making tea again, this time a far smaller batch and a far finer blend than she had served to the refugees. She arranged the tea, clover honey, and milk on the amber tray and carried it carefully into the scrying room, where she set it down on the table, bobbed a quick obeisance, and departed back into the kitchen. Ojo barely noticed that the tea had arrived, although he certainly needed it badly. He had hardly slept the night before, trying to think of arguments that might work with the High Skies leadership. "No one will condone this action," he said as forcefully as he dared. "We will become isolated. Mertika will have no difficulty finding allies against us." "Let them," said Nenge. "Once we have figured out the Rumican trick and have access to a substantial flow of airstone again, we will be able to face them all." "It is hardly wise," Ojo argued. "Much less moral," he added internally. "Our spies tell us Mertika has long been searching for an excuse to attack us. Cutting them off before they do is certainly wiser than the alternative," said Adokwe. "But this is a drastic move. Desperate times," Nenge said with something that sounded very much like satisfaction. "Desperate measures." Chapter 1. Anton. The survivor's condition worsened through the night, and Anton knew he needed to find help for her. even if it meant risking exposure to Harjo and whoever was paying him. But where could he take her? None of the doctors Chris had suggested were useful. Thinking of the stink in the office of the last one he visited, Anton shivered with remembered unease. He tried to think of who else he could ask. Shun would know the best doctors, but Anton wasn't sure he wanted to bring him in on this. At least not yet. No doctors, then. Someone who could do some healing, quietly. An embassy. All the embassies had doctors in their employ, and they would be discreet. Anton's feet turned instinctively to the Vanian embassy, but he shook his head. He needed to see Cassia, needed to talk to her about everything, but he didn't want to risk complicating the discussion with the problem of a witness to an international crime. Takeshi. Takeshi had always been respectful and willing to listen, and the Ikarans placed value on self-reliance, so he might even have the necessary medical supplies on site. The Hiroki turned swiftly and made his way to the Ikaran embassy. Takeshi answered the door himself and greeted Anton courteously. "Good morning. Have you eaten?" "No time. Now, water," Anton exclaimed, pushing into the embassy. "I need your help. I have a very sick, badly injured crewmate, and I need someone competent to heal her." Takeshi didn't protest or even show surprise. "If it were something simple, I could try to help here, but if it's that serious, it is, my friend, very serious, extremely urgent." Anton broke in. "Then your best bet is the clinic on Inculpet Street, on the lowest level." Takeshi went on. "Do you know it?" "In Little Zenitai? Yes, of course." Anton hadn't realized they had a clinic there, but it was perfect. The Zenitai were notoriously closed-mouthed. They wouldn't give the survivor up to Murtika or Kulo or whoever Harjo was working for. And the fact that it was on the lowest island was a relief. Anton had been thinking about the difficulty of getting the survivor up the lifts unnoticed, and the only alternative would be an illegal moorage on one of the higher islands. It wouldn't be the first time that the Blue Fang had unloaded cargo in defiance of Tuafe law, but it would be an added complication. "Thank you, Takeshi." Anton clasped his hands. "I owe you one." Takeshi shrugged into an outer robe. "I'll meet you there," he said. "I know the clinic staff. I can help." By the time Anton got back to the Blue Fang, hustled up people to help with the stretcher, bundled the survivor up sufficiently, and got everyone to the clinic, Takeshi was already there to greet them at the entrance. He took one look at Zan and rushed her into the back room. Anton told the stretcher carriers to return to the ship, and feeling suddenly lighter than he had in weeks, strolled back and forth in the tiny front parlor of the clinic. Clearly, harboring the survivor of an international incident had been weighing on him overmuch. He was going to have to find something to do with her if she made it through the clinic visit. He couldn't be responsible for holders of highly sensitive state secrets. Not for more than a few weeks, anyway. He had his own business to attend to, journeys to travel, adventures to advent, people to fight. As if on cue, the door to the clinic swung open. Anton leaped backward. "On guard!" "Again?" Harjo pulled his sword out with a sigh. "Come on, barnacle breath. The jig is up." "What jig?" Anton yelled. "I'm just here to visit my sister. She has a touch of misthrone, and..." He slashed wildly. "You'll never get her!" Harjo lowered his blade so he could put both hands on his knees and laugh heartily. Anton hovered just out of sword's reach, staying on his toes while he waited for Harjo to stop chortling. "What?" he asked finally. "Do you know who runs this clinic?" Harjo wheezed. "The Zanatans," Anton said cautiously. "Yeah, or to be more specific, the Resurgence." Anton's eyes went wide. He didn't pay much attention to Tuafe politics, but he did try to keep up with most of the radical, crazy, and unpredictable rebel groups floating around the sky, and the faction looking to restore Zanatan nationhood definitely counted in that number. Harjo nodded, seeing the recognition. "Also known as my current employers." Anton thought about that, then whipped around and made for the treatment theater. Wait! Harjo yelled, catching Anton's arm. "You can relax," he added as Anton threw off his grip. "I was only supposed to find information about her." "What do you mean?" Anton was still suspicious. "You're trying to nab her?" "My orders were just to find out what was going on, and whether she knew anything about the attack." "You could have told me that," Anton exploded. "You wouldn't talk to me," Harjo said. "Besides, the game was more fun." Anton snorted and put up his sword. So, does she know anything? Harjo asked conversationally while he sheathed his own blade. I don't know yet, Anton said, watching the door of the treatment theater. She was too sick to speak coherently. I guess you'll just have to wait and see, Harjo said, tipping his plumed hat as he headed for the door. Where are you going? Anton cried. Don't you at least want to know if she survives? My contract is finished, Haruki, Harjo answered. I don't care about the fate of nations. Chapter 2. Michiko. Michiko was getting tired of being called to the Mertican embassy at all hours of the day. Her stress at seeing the embassy courier had gotten so bad that she had fallen into the habit of cutting a quick sigil of calm during the short walk. It was an embarrassing waste of resources for something she should have been able to manage, but Michiko told herself that with the extra tension of the Golden Lord visiting her every time she channeled her ancestors, it was understandable. Summoning her 3 hours after sunset was ridiculous, even by Lavinia's standards. And then being kept waiting for another 15 minutes was just insulting. Michiko wondered if Kensuke had been treated like this, if maybe years of this kind of disrespect had made him what he was. But she didn't know what else to do, so she went, careful to scrub all resentment from her face before she finally was ushered into the small meeting room. It didn't matter because Lavinia didn't even look up from whatever she was writing. You're here, she said. Took you long enough. Michiko bit her tongue on the retort that she had been waiting to be shown in. Was it possible that this had been an error of the servants rather than Lavinia's design? I know you've been talking to Ambassador Kante. Michiko made sure her face betrayed nothing, but she could feel her pulse quickening. Could Lavinia know she had been investigating the disappearance of the Rumican fleet? Suddenly, the fact that they were alone in the room, without even Bellona as a witness, seemed frighteningly significant. She thought frantically. Who could have told Lavinia she was asking about the fleet? I want you to cultivate that relationship, Lavinia went on. We need to know where that dreadnought went and what it is doing. They didn't bring it here just to loom over us. They have plans. Michiko was too guarded to feel relieved that Lavinia had not accused her of investigating the fleet disappearance. For all she knew, the Mertican warder was merely delaying the attack. I am not on such terms with Ambassador Kante as to discuss their plans, she said. And even if I was, I'm not sure he knows. Nobody suggested you discuss it with him. Lavinia snapped, finally looking up from her desk. Discuss something else and use the conversation to find out. Or snoop, that seems to be something you're good at. Again, Michiko kept her expression neutral. Was Lavinia playing with her? I don't know what you mean by that, but I can try to find out where the dreadnought is. I can't promise I'll be successful. Lavinia fixed her with a long stare, before finally turning back to her papers with a sniff. Well, then, I suppose it will be war. War? Michiko had been expecting war for weeks now, but the casual way Lavinia said it still gave her chills. Which reminds me, Lavinia pulled one of the papers off her desk with a flourish. We will, of course, be instituting a conscription in all the colonies. Here is the directive for Kakute. She held the paper out, but didn't release her grip until Michiko's eyes met her own, and then she smiled. I'll let you pass it on to your country as you think best, but do it soon. I expect we'll see fighting within the 10-day. Chapter 3. Anton. Waiting at the clinic gave Anton plenty of time to think about what to do with the survivor. He couldn't keep protecting her much longer. Hiding her had already caused problems in his relationship with Cassia, and he needed to resolve those so that he could get back out in the mists where he belonged. Islandless themselves, the Zanatans were often sympathetic to the Hiroki, and since they were stuck on Tuafe, he could see why they might be more interested in the machinations of the great powers than he was. Done. He could give the survivor to the Zanatans. As he came to this conclusion, Takeshi walked out of the treatment theater, accompanied by an older woman. Takeshi! Anton said, rushing over to shake his hand. This is perfect. Takeshi blinked at him, swaying with exhaustion. Anton, your crewmate is going to be fine. Oh, Anton had forgotten about the possibility that she might not survive. Yes, that's wonderful, but also, I'm sorry, Anton, I need to rest. Takeshi said, extricating his hand from Anton's grip. Dr. Takada here will tell you more. Anton and Dr. Takada eyed each other as Takeshi made for the door. Very interesting and valuable crewmate you have, Hiroki, Takada said finally. Ah, good, I don't have to explain, Anton said. So, you'll help her? We already helped her. She needs a place to stay, Anton explained. Protection, a way to tell her story, a way to get home. I can't do all that for her, I'm a pirate. Takada was already shaking her head. I'm sorry, but we can't keep her here. The Zenatan community is always the scapegoat when anything goes wrong. Not more than the Hiroki. The Hiroki are Sky, the Zenatans in Tuafe, Takada said firmly. With the refugee crisis growing, we can't take a risk right now. Besides, we have other concerns. But you had Harcho trying to find her, because we wanted to know what she had to say, and now, Takada said with a smile, we do. She inclined her head toward the door. Why don't you go have a chat with her, and then figure out what you're going to do next? Chapter 4. Chris. Chris had never been inside the Tsukusen embassy before. As if in echo of their famously isolationist and aloof tendencies, it was tucked behind a high hedge of sphaler, leaves now glossy and dark. When Chris pulled the bell, they were allowed in only to a small courtyard surrounded by the same hedge. They couldn't even see the door of the embassy proper. Maybe it was an intentional reference to their secretiveness. Chris had met a fair number of Tsukuseni at inter-island tournaments. In fact, isolationism had ironically been a form of common ground between Tsukusen and Rumika. They had always found that charm worked as well on Tsukuseni as on anyone else. Chris wasn't sure it would be enough to get them what they wanted in this case, but they hoped it would at least get them through the door. While they waited, pacing the courtyard, they flipped through their knowledge of Tsukusen culture. All the common jokes and puns, the latest stars of song and stage. Warder he probably wouldn't react much to that sort of reference, but it might help with the younger diplomatic aides. Get in the door, Chris told himself. You're a warder, get in to talk to him, and then take it from there. It wasn't a young Tsukuseni who finally came back out through the inner gate to meet them, but the same servant who had let them into the courtyard initially, an expression of regret on his face. I'm so sorry, he said. The warder is unavailable now. Chris felt panic rising. Can you tell me when I might come back to see him? The servant was already shaking his head, guiding Chris's steps back to the main gate. He will send word when he is ready to speak with you. Determined not to let anyone in the Tsukusen embassy see how disheartened they were, Chris set off at a brisk pace. No time to waste. They had other embassies to visit. Chris had thought Tsukusen might be an easy win because of the tenuous cultural ties. That out of the way, though, their steps quickened as purpose buoyed their mood again. Might as well move on to the most critical. Chris was almost sure Vania would not sit out the war. Everyone said they could not resist battle, and everything they had seen since of Vanians on Tuafe reinforced that. Well, everything they had seen of Penelope. Chris could imagine Cassia happily missing out on a war, but she seemed to be somewhat atypical. Assuming the Vanians joined the conflict, it was absolutely vital they joined on Rumika's side. Even Murtika might hesitate to face the combined might of Kulo and Vania. It would spell certain doom for Rumika. Cassia at least was willing to let Chris into the embassy, and even to listen to what they had to say. She received them in a small office draped with symbols of Vanian power. Cross battle swords on the wall above the desk, finely wrought ornamental gauntlets on the cabinet, a rug depicting the bloody victory at Poinkat, some 300 years ago. Cassia, curled up on the chair in her pale robes, didn't quite seem to fit the decor. Chris noticed that she was twisting her fingers as she listened to their plea, and tried to take strength from it. Even I've been a warder longer than she has, Chris thought. She's still nervous. But when Cassia spoke, her voice and syntax were both firm. I can't give you an answer now. I must speak to my government. Even if you could just promise to not ally against us, Chris began to argue, but she cut them off. I am not empowered to make such promises, not yet. And if I were, I would still wish to wait for further evidence. Evidence? Chris couldn't understand how anyone could believe Rumika might sabotage their own ships. Maybe I could present my case to your government directly? That is not how we do things, Cassia said with finality and rang for the servant to see them out. Chris tried again to get their energy back up by pacing away with determination, but the effectiveness of the technique was fading. They were keeping up the long stride and straight back for appearance's sake when their peripheral vision caught something coming out of the alley between the Vanian embassy and the florist shop next to it. Chris jumped sideways, pulling their blade as they did. Hey, easy there, friend, Anton said, putting his hands up and stepping back a few paces. Just wanted to say hi. I'm not trying to start an international incident or anything. Good thing, Chris muttered, sheathing their blade and resuming their walk of power. We have enough of those going around already. Indeed, Anton matched Chris's stride. There does seem to be something in the mists lately, doesn't there? Chris snorted, annoyed with the facile and blameless framing of the situation. You mean like unprovoked attacks, colonialist rhetoric, stronger powers ganging up on the weak? Yeah, I'd say something is going around. None of that feels new or unusual to a Hiroki, Anton pointed out. The fact that it was probably true did not improve Chris's mood. But I wanted to talk to you about one specific international incident. Anton went on and hemmed with unusual hesitancy. The loss of the Rumican war fleet? Trading fleet, Chris yelled, stopping in the middle of the street. Monarch's Tooth, it was a trading fleet, not a war fleet. Whoever attacked them did so entirely unprovoked, in defiance of all the conventions. Yes, indeed, Anton said. And about that, was it you? Chris asked, hand on their hilt again. Did the Hiroki make our ships disappear? Why? No, of course not, Anton laughed. 6 well-armed ships is not exactly our style. Chris wasn't entirely convinced by that argument, but for the moment they had no reason to believe otherwise, and they felt too exhausted to jump into another morass, so they contented themselves with muttering, Good thing. Chris started walking again. What embassy to try next? Should they talk to Kakute and Ikaro or go straight to the Mertikans? But about that attack, look, Anton, Chris rounded on him again. I'm happy to see you again, but I'm a little busy right now trying to prevent war from escalating. Ah, yes, I saw you just came out of the Vanian embassy. Anton dropped his eyes for the first time in the conversation. Did you, happen to see that paragon of elegance and ferocity, my lovely Cassia? Is she well rested? Well fed? She seemed worn and weary last time. I don't have time for this, Chris ground out. If I can't find allies soon, allies for war, not just friends to drink with, my homeland is doomed. They walked away again, and this time Anton didn't follow. Something else the Hiroki are used to, the pirate muttered and then turned away. Chapter 5. Bologna. Although both of them would have been surprised to know it, Bologna had taken to using the same calming sigil that Michiko did whenever Lavinia demanded her presence. In this case, at least, Lavinia wasn't angry at something Bologna had done, or not done. Bologna knew that as soon as she walked into the Mauve's study, because Lavinia continued with her paperwork instead of turning on Bologna with those ferocious eyes. That didn't mean whatever was coming would be pleasant, though, and Bologna was glad of the magic keeping her stomach acid from roiling. Right, Lavinia said finally, crossing off one final note and turning her gaze on Bologna. No, she didn't look angry, but her stare gave the impression of deep disappointment, and Bologna steeled herself. I'm leaving. That was not what Bologna was expecting, and she clenched her teeth to keep her jaw from falling open. You'll be acting warder, inevitably, Lavinia went on, but you are under no circumstances to consider it a promotion. You will observe and report to me. You will consult me before making any decision, no matter how minor it may seem to you. Is that clear? Even Bologna's well-practiced, yes, warder Junius, reaction was failing her. But the communication difficulties. I doubt there will be anything so urgent that it cannot wait a day or two for you to get in touch with me. And if there is, stall. Why are you leaving, then? Bologna blurted out. It was a breach of etiquette, but for once Lavinia didn't seem to mind. Going where I'm needed, my dear, she answered, lips curved in a smile. War will begin outright any day now, and the best commanders are all being recalled to lead the fight. Bologna's face heated as though she had been slapped. True, she had never in any of her lives held a command position, but surely the valor and battlefield brilliance she had shown in her last incarnation merited an opportunity. Even returning to war as a common soldier would be acceptable because it would offer her a chance to distinguish herself. But this? Bologna wanted to say something cutting yet dignified and forceful enough to recall her wartime exploits. But the words she managed to choke out sounded plaintive. If you don't trust me enough to let me make decisions here while you're away, why don't you stay as warder and I'll go to war? Lavinia's smile widened. What a ridiculous idea. Right now, you see, war is far more important than diplomacy. Chapter 6. Chris. Chris decided to continue with the Ikarans, not because they had any real hope of help from that quarter, but because at the moment they couldn't bring themselves to face Lavinia or even Michiko. Going to see Takeshi somehow wasn't as painful a thought. Maybe it was because Chris had gotten to know him a little better during their practice sessions. Takeshi was always reserved, but in the sweaty aftermath of a rigorous training session, he was more likely to laugh at a joke or even crack one himself. And he always seemed pleased to see Chris. He seemed pleased now, even though he had to know that the visit promised some level of uncomfortable conversation. He invited Chris in immediately and ordered tea for them both in his odd turret room. None of his experiments were actually bubbling at that moment, but Chris peered at some of the tubes and strangely shaped glass bowls holding mysterious substances. Any progress? They asked. Takeshi answered with his usual half-smile. Hard to say. Sometimes in this work you don't know. What seems useless may be helpful later. Chris opened their mouth to answer, but was distracted by the idea that Takeshi's statement might hold true for diplomacy as well. They were already feeling guilty about being so rude to Anton. I know you're very busy, so I'll get to the point. I'm hoping to rally support for my country. We are under attack, unjustly, and so far no one seems to be willing to stand with us against our attackers. Chris had told himself to be calm, to not get their hopes up, but they couldn't help becoming agitated when they talked about it. Without help, I just don't know how long we can hold out. I am hoping that Ikaro could provide us at least some kind of support. If not troops, then perhaps logistical or financial. Takeshi stood, head turned away, and began fiddling with the dials on one of his magnet contraptions. Finally, he lifted his eyes to meet Chris's gaze. I'm sorry. I have to wait to see what Murtika will do. I wish I could say something different, but this is the reality for my people at this time. Chris felt despair rising in their chest. Don't be sorry, they choked out. It's not your fault. If it helps, Takeshi said, I believe Murtika will support you. Chris remembered Lavinia's boot crashing into their injured arm. Really? Takeshi looked mildly amused. Of course. Do you think they will side with Kulo? Chris shrugged. I guess I imagined they'd find a way to humiliate both of us. Takeshi laughed. I'm sure Lavinia will try. But you have to remember, Lavinia is not all of Murtika. Most of them care more about the practicalities of maintaining power than enjoying it in such sadistic ways. Chris let themselves sag into a chair. I'm not sure that being in debt to Murtika counts as being saved. You are not wrong, Takeshi replied, but it is still better than outright destruction. They sat in grim but companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea. Chris was reluctant to bring up the other matter on their mind, but they felt they needed to. I heard about your altercation with Adechike. The Ikaran warder's eyes grew dark. What of it? Takeshi, you nearly choked the life from him. I did no such thing, he scoffed. I merely made sure I had his attention. Chris frowned. Still, I know you liked him. I did too. They chose their next words carefully. Adechike wronged all of us, but I know that you acted out of loyalty to me, and I don't take that lightly. Takeshi lowered his eyes abruptly. He began, then breathed out and started over. As you said, he wronged all of us. Chris smiled, then rose. I'll leave you to your work, but please know your friendship means everything to me. Takeshi stood and answered with a slight bow. I hope you will still have time for training this week. Count on it, Chris said, grasping his hand. Chris had only gone a few blocks from the Ikaran embassy when they heard their name called and turned to see Alex hurrying toward them. As Alex got closer, Chris saw that he had undergone the change and was now masculine. Chris was immediately annoyed with himself for forgetting they should be more aware of their colleagues' schedules. It was clear that Alex had more substantive issues on his mind. There's something you need to see, he said, and guided Chris along the fastest route to the lifts. Chapter 7. Michiko. Sitting in the office that she could not help but think of as Kensuke's, Michiko crumpled another failed attempt at composing the conscription notice. Part of her wanted to present Lavinia's order in its cold, condescending entirety for the anger it would bring. But people would suffer enough through the conscription. If she could soften that by composing a better order, one closer to Kakute concerns and values. But of course that was what Lavinia wanted her for, to make this seem like a local initiative rather than one forced by Murtika. Michiko sighed and set aside the order. She was not going to get any further with it, in this mood. Wishing only to stop this horrible slide into war, her thoughts turned to the disappearance of the Rumikan fleet. If only that had never happened, the situation would be so different now. Or perhaps if she had managed to find out who was responsible. So far, however, all her investigations had led to nothing. No indication of guilt. There had to be something she was missing. Michiko stood and reached for her wrap. She would go see Ojo. Maybe at this point he would be willing to tell her more. Besides, she thought as she trod the familiar path to the Kuloi embassy, she was worried about him. Every time she saw Ojo, he looked more haggard and sorrowful. And, come to think of it, she had only seen him recently at official warder business. She hadn't seen him at the Leaf in ages. Michiko was ushered into the warder's office in the Kuloi embassy almost immediately. Ojo's desk was piled with paperwork, but he stood quickly to greet her.
Michiko,
he said, hands out.
How are you? Everything all right?
For a moment, she caught a glimpse of the solicitous, warm man she had met and distrusted when she'd first arrived in Tuafe. Odd that now, when Ojo had so much more reason to deceive her, she was much more ready to believe him. I'm fine, she answered as lightly as she could. Discovering all the joys of being a warder? She nodded at the mounds of paperwork with what she hoped was a wry smile. More important, how are you? Ojo grimaced, the weight falling back onto his shoulders.
I've been better.
Warder Kante, Michiko said hesitantly, I've been thinking about how quickly these problems have worsened and how much of it comes back to the disappearance of the Rumikan trade fleet. Is there anything more you can tell me about what happened, or where I might look to understand it better? Ojo stared at her silently for so long, Michiko began to worry she had offended him. But when he finally spoke, it was not to demand an apology, but to offer one.
I'm sorry. At this point, I'm surprised that anyone is willing to take my opinion on the matter seriously.
Michiko flushed, feeling that she had done something wrong, or the worse, stupid. I never thought you were in favor of this conflict, she blurted. But the true story of the ambush could justify action as well. Somebody harmed you. Wouldn't it be better? Ojo waved his hands to stop her.
You don't need to convince me.
He thought for a moment.
I suppose you have looked for suspicious circumstances among the most obvious suspects.
I haven't been able to find anything, Michiko said, which doesn't mean there isn't anything to be found, but...
And I'm sorry to bring this up, but when you took over from Warder Heike, you didn't find anything unusual?
It was Michiko's turn to hesitate. Nothing that I can be sure has any bearing on this subject. Even as she said it, she knew she was giving away too much of her uncertainty, but Ojo did not show any undue interest.
Of course, he said, I have my theory. Perhaps the best way to explain my thinking is to ask who has the capability of covering their tracks so thoroughly.
He waited for her to think it through, then went on.
If I had the resources and freedom to investigate the ambush, I would try to imagine where the evidence might be if it were Murtika that had perpetrated the act, and I would look there.
Michiko hadn't expected him to be so blunt, and she didn't know how to respond. Then she remembered Lavinia's request. Suddenly she was angry. An impulse she decided to match Ojo's bluntness, a tiny rebellion Lavinia would never know about. Warder Kante, where has the dreadnought gone? What is it doing? She hadn't thought Ojo's face could get grimmer.
You'll find out soon enough.
Chapter 8. Chris. Chris wandered the warehouse in a state of shock. There must be hundreds of people here. Hundreds of Rumikins, all displaced and desperate. And it was in part because of Chris's actions. They couldn't believe they'd ever thought being a warder would be glamorous and exciting. 312 at the last count, said the woman who was guiding Chris and Alex around. Miho, she had said her name was. Most of them arrived in the last week. The warehouse had no flooring, just packed dirt, and cheap Ikaran carpets had been laid out. As they walked, Chris noticed that the woven squares not only covered the ground, but also served as makeshift territorial divisions, with families and groups settling themselves within the borders of one or two carpets. It was chilly in the vast space, and some families had wrapped themselves in additional carpets, giving the entire scene a patchwork feel that, for all the bright colors, was oddly desolate. I had no idea, Chris said, turning to her in an intensity of guilt. I had heard that a few people fled after the Kuloi attacks, but I didn't know it was so many. I didn't know they'd come here. How did they get here? Alex asked. Mostly on small boats, a few on rafts. Miho didn't need to say that many must have foundered into the mists. Some of the arrivals have found other places to live. We think the total number that made it to Toifé is over 400. On a red and blue carpet, a few steps in front of them, Chris saw a young Rumikin, their hair and garb signaling the same androgyny that Chris preferred, huddled in a carpet. Their gaze struck Chris as even more hopeless than the others. That's the navigator of the raft that came in yesterday, Miho said, following their eyes. They exhausted their energy during the trip, and they were completely unconscious when they were brought on land. Will they recover? Chris thought of all the times they had complained of exhaustion or congratulated themselves on training beyond normal endurance. This youth had truly pushed themselves to the brink, and for a much more important cause than Chris's efforts to improve their blade craft. The medics saw them earlier, and they should be fine, but... Miho said, lowering her voice as they approached. The medic said that the exhaustion will make the adjustment to new circumstances much more difficult, emotionally. She sighed a little, and Chris glanced at her. I am Zanatan, Miho explained. We have learned painfully that the destruction of a home isn't the end of life, but when I look at these people, I can't help remembering what we have suffered, and everything that they are likely to endure. Chris's grip tightened on the hilt of their sword. Rumika was not going to become another Zenatai, not if they had to fight every warder on the island again to prevent it. As they walked past, the young navigator turned their wan face up to look at them, and on impulse, Chris dropped into a crouch beside them. Greetings, Chris murmured. My name is Kristan. I wanted to thank you for your heroic efforts in bringing people here safely. The navigator looked blank for a moment, then shook their head. There was nothing heroic about it, they said, voice bleak. I didn't have a choice. Before Chris could think of an answer to that, the navigator, as if remembering the pleasantries, put out their hand. Aaron Mott. I'm from Amber. That sent another chill down Chris's spine. Are people evacuating from Amber? Aaron managed something like a smile, although it was bitter. No, not yet, at least. I was living in Ul. Chris hadn't heard of any attacks on Ul, either. What made you decide to flee? Aaron stared at them in disbelief. Everyone is leaving Ul, everyone who can. Some are going to Amber, but we thought if we move and then we have to move again, it was better to go all at once. They were silent for a moment, gathering their strength. The Kuloi ships pass every night, back and forth. Sometimes they fire munitions. The army said they were just blanks, that they were war exercises meant to intimidate us, but, well, it worked. Anytime they want, they can attack all. We have no protection." Chris swallowed, but could say nothing to contradict this. "And here, have you received everything you need?" Aaron looked around the warehouse, and Chris was struck again by the hopelessness in their eyes. "Everything we need? Yes, I suppose so. People have been very kind," they said as an afterthought. Chris thanked Aaron and stood, their own blood burning with the shame of needing assistance from strangers. "I'll do something about this," they promised, addressing Alex and Miho, though neither of them had spoken. "I'll talk to Yokno about improving the conditions here, and I'll talk to the council. Kulo must be made to face what they've done." Chapter 9. Bologna. Becoming a warder, even a joke of a temporary warder with no power, required a lot of paperwork, process, and pomp. Bologna spent most of the afternoon receiving endless instructions from Lavinia, the bulk of them not even about diplomacy, but just about how to run the embassy and seat people for state dinners, and then spent the evening standing for the tailoring adjustments to official robes, choosing stationery, and filling in forms. 4 hours after sunset, she still hadn't finished the latter, but she needed a break. Lavinia might not be asleep yet, but she was shut up in her room, and this might be Bologna's last chance for some time to herself before the full weight of wardership descended upon her. Bologna set off for the Falling Leaf. All that effort, only to continue to work under Lavinia's thumb. Bologna fumed as she walked the narrow streets toward the tea house. And the worst of it was that she was being sidelined from the war. It was as if her past selves had done nothing of note at all. So much for the gratitude of the Empire. Not for the first time, Bologna was grateful she did not have the Kakutan birthright of communing with the dead. Dealing with additional generations of disappointment and resentment was unthinkable. As usual, her mood improved the moment she stepped into the tea house. There was so much going on, tables of merchants celebrating sales or building new deals, mid-level Toife bureaucrats drinking off another day of what Bologna could only imagine was mind-numbing work, a theater troupe getting rowdy at the long central table. Her gaze lingered on a table in the corner, protected by partially drawn drapes. Was that one of the embassy servants? Well, no matter. Even servants were entitled to relax once their tasks were complete. Besides, Bologna had just caught sight of something much more interesting. A Dechike sitting alone, a tankard of persimmon-tinged ale in front of him. She couldn't help smiling as she sidled up to his table and slid uninvited into the seat across from him. "A Dechike!" she exclaimed as he raised his reddened eyes in surprise. "I haven't seen you in so long. How are you?" "Fine," he mumbled as Bologna raised her arm to signal a waiter. "And that is not so good, really." "Creme wine," Bologna told the server and turned the focus of her brilliance back on a Dechike. She was feeling better already. "What's wrong? I'm sure things must be difficult in your embassy right now." Dechike grimaced but didn't rise to the bait. "I thought I had so many friends here, and now no one will talk to me. Chris thinks I spied on them, but I didn't. He shook his head, almost spilling his glass in the process, and Bologna noted that he was more than a little drunk. "I have a terrible memory, and I write things down, and I thought I could trust..." The server reappeared, and Dechike stopped long enough for him to put Bologna's drink down. As soon as the server was out of earshot, Dechike went on. "I just got here, and somehow I've ruined everything." Bologna looked at her glass and took a slow, meditative sip in case he would be embarrassed by her seeing his tears. "I'm sure it's not that bad," she said to the air beside his face. "You just happened to arrive during a rough time, but people will come around. It's not your fault that certain people are behaving irresponsibly in the international sphere." Quite proud of her formulation, Bologna took another mouthful of the creme wine. "You know," she began, and stopped. For a moment, her vision shifted, and she saw not a Dechike, her young enthusiastic friend, but instead a representative of the country that was almost certainly about to be her avowed enemy. But Bologna shook it off. After all, being close to someone in the Kuloi embassy could only be helpful, and a Dechike needed someone. "We're going to fix this," she said, reaching out to pat his shoulder with the hand that wasn't holding her glass. "Don't worry, I'll come up with something amazing to reintroduce you into Warder society." If Adechike protested, Bologna was too energized to notice, and he was too drunk to persist. Chapter 10. Michiko. The ancestor ritual had felt oddly lonely since Kensuke had left. It wasn't really any different because he always gave Michiko her privacy, but now she was more aware of the darkness of the embassy around her. Maybe it was the weight of responsibility. Her ancestor seemed to think so. "How is it going, Warder Oda?" Uncle Hiroaki asked jovially. "Any important decisions today?" "We didn't have a council meeting today, Uncle," Michiko said, avoiding his question. "Are you taking care of yourself, dear?" Aunt Aiko asked. "It must be a lot of stress." That question was so apt that it brought tears to Michiko's eyes, but she blinked them away. "It is no more than I have trained for, Aunt."
"Murtika's up to something, of course,"
grumbled the Golden Lord from his usual corner in her mind.
"What have they done now?"
"Leave her alone," Aiko retorted in a surprisingly daring response. "Obviously she's troubled.
Obviously she is, and I'll wager it's their fault. Come now, granddaughter, you must have the need to consult."
Michiko hadn't thought consciously about discussing the conscription order with them, but now that it occurred to her, she realized it must have been in the back of her mind the entire time. The desire to talk about this horrible choice was too powerful for her to resist. "They have... Warder Junius ordered me to put forth a conscription mandate for Kakute."
"War?"
Uncle Hiroaki crowed into the following silence.
"That is excellent, my dear. A chance for us to prove ourselves again. You should tell that warder that conscription won't be necessary for Kakute."
But his voice faded into uncertainty at the end of his boast.
"This is an outrage."
Michiko heard Aunt Aiko sigh faintly, as though she had been waiting for the Golden Lord's explosion.
"They are using our people to prosecute their vile colonialist plots and forcing you into complicity. And they have the temerity to suggest we are lacking in courage. Why, those mistborn scum don't have the valor of—"
As the Golden Lord rambled on, Aunt Aiko whispered close to Michiko's ear,
"You are not comfortable with this, my dear."
Michiko just shook her head, unable to trust her voice. The Golden Lord's ranting was giving her a piercing headache.
"You are the warder," Aiko whispered, "and no one else."
Michiko jerked, surprised by even such oblique approval, but before she could respond further, the Golden Lord wrapped up his monologue.
"You must not do this, granddaughter,"
he said, his bluster suddenly replaced by an almost melancholy quietude.
"Think of the suffering. Generations of suffering. There is no honor in dying for someone else's war."
Chapter 11. A Sky. The Rumikan island of Gusp was unpopulated, but for a few hardy skinks and their insect prey. Scarcely larger than the Grand Theater Hall in Amber, Gusp was the farthest flung of a spray of tiny hillocks of rock and airstone that stretched from Rumika's northwest peninsula. It was not normally visible from the main island. The dreadnought, however, was. Its massive bulk had appeared around dusk, leaving the villagers who happened to see it uneasy but unsure that it was not simply a cloud or an extraordinarily large mist fiend or perhaps a ship passing by, unusually close to land. At dawn, however, the metallic hull shone dully on the horizon, too big and too still to be anything but an engine of war. A luckless local official was dragged from bed to witness it, and immediately sent runners to the capital. By that time, however, it was too late. Long before the national government had any inkling of what was happening, the dreadnought had shifted into motion, riding the mists inexorably west. The villagers gathered on Akron Hill had expected the gargantuan warship to come straight toward them. "Why us and Amber?" had been the most frequent comment. Their relief was short-lived. The official with the spyglass began to shout. "Gusp!" she yelled. She dropped the spyglass, staring into the distance as if that would somehow elucidate what she was seeing, and then raised it again, cutting a quick eagle-eye sigil to supplement it. In its trembling circle, the rocky hillock was clear enough to distinguish massive chains wrapped around its peak. The island shuddered. The crowd gasped as it became obvious, even to those without augmented sight, that the island was moving. Curls of mist swirled in its wake as, slow but irrefutable, Gusp followed in the wake of the dreadnought, in the direction of Culo. Chapter 12. Chris. The refugees need help. Chris tried to keep their voice level. They remembered Ojo's advice when they first arrived.
With Yokno, always be respectful. He puts much value in the proper forms and tones of address.
Mists, but it seemed like years ago. Have you been to the warehouse? Yokno raised an eyebrow.
My associates have visited and have reported back to me, and we have not been insensible. Perhaps you are not aware that the warehouse is Twafei property.
That silenced Chris briefly, and Yokno went on.
We are also providing food.
Only one meal a day? Chris jumped in, and Yokno frowned.
Our coffers are not inexhaustible water den.
Chris heard the emphasis on their title. Yokno was reminding them that this was a formal situation. Ojo had been right, of course. Chris felt a stab of regret for the loss of his kind of mentoring. But of course it had never really been kind, had it? Just a way of getting the advantage of Rumika. Yokno was still talking.
And with the added defenses required by certain recent events, we simply cannot spare any further assistance at this time. He paused. Perhaps this is something we'd like to bring up with the council?
That will take days, weeks perhaps, for funding to be allocated. Chris pulled at their hair in frustration.
Perhaps not, Yokno replied. Pursuant to Chapter 93, Paragraph 8 of the Legal Code, in emergency circumstances, certain budget procedures may be abridged, for example.
Chris left the Twafei government building an hour later, not very enlightened by the jumble of legal statutes, but determined to at least try raising funds through the council. Although we need more than money, they griped to Alex. We need a resolution to this crisis. These people need to go home. Indeed, Alex agreed in the way that indicated Chris was missing something. And in the meantime, shall I allocate some funds from the embassy? Yes, of course, Chris said. Maybe, what do you think they need most now? Blankets? More food? I will consult with the people working there, Alex suggested. Immediately, please, Chris said. I'm going to the Kakute embassy, and perhaps I will find support there for the refugees, if not for our larger cause. Good luck, said Alex, and peeled off toward the lifts. Chris had been delaying going to see Michiko. Realistically, they didn't think there was much chance that she would defy Murtika to help Rumika, and they didn't want to lose their tenuous friendship over an impossibility. But remembering the way she'd acted during the gauntlet, Chris didn't think they could pass up the chance to ask. It felt odd to see Michiko behind Kensuke's desk. Chris had to smile, if ruefully, and on impulse they discarded their carefully considered opening statement. Who would have thought that so soon after we arrived we'd both be full warders? Michiko seemed to hesitate, but then she matched Chris's smile. Strange times, she murmured. Strange and difficult, Chris agreed. They straightened, taking on the formal trappings of a request. I know you are in a difficult position now, Warder Oda, but so is my country. I want to ask for your support in this unjust and unprovoked conflict. Michiko stopped. We continue to consider ourselves great friends of Rumika. She stopped again. I believe that in the near future we might find that the actors in the conflict have increased in number, perhaps in a way beneficial to your country. Chris stared at her, trying to parse. I can't speak plainly now, Michiko said, a little exasperated at their denseness. But I hope... Well, you know, Chris, I would like to support you, but I would like far more for there to be no war at all. Chris frowned. The war is not my doing, nor Rumika's. Michiko sighed. Maybe not, but maybe if we can find some explanation for the fleet's disappearance, maybe you can help to stop it. Chris smiled sadly. I think it is too late for that, Michiko. Everything that's happened... There was a pause as they both thought over the past few weeks. And I have just learned that the number of refugees who have arrived in Twafei from Rumika is even higher than I thought. With who knows how many more lost in the journey, we have to do something. But maybe that something shouldn't be aimed at Kulot, Michiko said urgently. Maybe... She was interrupted by a quick pounding on the door, and a servant burst in almost before the word enter had left Michiko's mouth. "Warder Oda," he said, gasping, then flicked a glance to Chris and then back to Michiko's frown. Even so, he barely hesitated. "There is news. Extraordinary news that we thought you should know at once." Michiko hesitated for the barest second, then nodded. "Warder Den, if you will excuse us for a moment?" Uneasy, Chris stepped out to the anteroom. As the door closed behind them, they heard, "From a ship that just arrived." They paced the room twice, wondering if they should go back to their own embassy to get whatever this news was there, but before they could transit the small space a third time, Michiko burst from the door. "Warder Den, I'm afraid this news concerns you as well." She took a breath. "There are reports that Kulot has stolen an outlying island from Rumika." Chris went entirely blank for a moment. "Which one?" they managed finally. Michiko glanced at the servant, then shook her head. "All I know is that it was uninhabited. Presumably the Kuloi are attempting to make up for some of the lost airstone, but I never imagined that they would be so desperate as to do something like that." Chris was still stunned. "But stealing a whole island, and even that it will not net them nearly the amount of airstone discussed in the deal." "Perhaps it is more a show of force," Michiko said grimly. "If you would like, you could accompany me to the lowest island. I would like to interview the crew of the ship that brought this news personally." Chris agreed, gratefully, pausing only to send a message by courier to their own embassy. Probably they should have gone themselves to contact their government, but they were itching to do something, and the fast pace that Michiko set through the city streets did something to satisfy that urge. "It's a ship called the Green Parrot," Michiko told them as they cut through an alley. "They were traveling from Tsukisen with a cargo of fabric and happened to see—" She stopped as they came to the crowded area around the lifts, and they rode downward in silence, Chris chafing at the enforced stillness of the ride. As soon as they dropped below the middle island, Chris smelled smoke. "What is that?" Michiko asked, wrinkling her nose as the scent became more pungent. Surely they won't have attacked the witnesses." Chris shook their head. Anything seemed possible. Although, it seems like too much to be one ship and too close to be in the docks. They peered from the windows of the lift, but the angle didn't let them get much of a view of the lower island. Then the lift landed, and its doors opened on chaos. "What is going on?" Michiko gasped. The plaza in front of the lifts was seething with people, and as the two warders slipped out of the carriage, the mass surged forward trying to board. "They're trying to get off this level." Chris heard the tremor in their own voice. Their hand had moved automatically to their blade, and they saw that Michiko was also holding the hilt of hers. "Come on," she said, and led them around the edge of the plaza. When they reached a place with a little more breathing room, she grabbed at the sleeve of one of the women milling toward the lifts. "What is it? What's going on?" The woman turned with a face full of fear. "It's that flotsam from Rumika," she cried out, clamoring for more and more, as if we hadn't helped them. "And now they've set the warehouse row on fire." "What? No!" Chris took off, pushing their way through the crowd toward the refugee warehouse. "Chris, wait!" Michiko called, but the mass of frightened people was already closing between them. Chapter 13. Michiko. Michiko pushed against the crowd of people funneling toward the lifts, but she was getting nowhere. She usually tried to avoid using bladecraft in public, but she was getting shoved from all sides. Michiko almost panicked when the press of bodies prevented her from getting her sword out of its scabbard, but she swung her elbows until she had enough space to pull it out almost vertically, and then, holding the tip toward the sky, carved Airstone stance. She felt dizzy with relief as she leaped into the chill air above the crowd, landing lightly on a rooftop on the edge of the plaza. She rested there, breathing deeply, and feeling the sweat cool on her skin while scanning for Chris. Michiko didn't know where the refugees had been located, but that woman in the crowd had said that the warehouse row was on fire. So when she had gotten her breath back, she started leaping rooftop to rooftop in toward the column of black smoke in the western sky. She found Chris 2 blocks down the street, standing on a windowsill, trying to talk to a yelling mass of angry people. Michiko had to jump down to stand on the windowsill next to Chris before she could understand what they were trying to say. "The refugees are not a threat," Chris was shouting hoarsely. "They need our help." Their voice was barely audible against the rumble of the mob. "Chris," Michiko yelled, "this is useless. We need to get out of here." Chris didn't seem surprised to see her there. Michiko wasn't sure they'd noticed that they'd gotten separated. "These people are angry at the refugees," they said, sounding astonished. "They think the refugees set fire to their own shelter. Why would they do that?" Glass shattered somewhere, and Michiko felt something rattle down over her. She curled instinctively, covering her head with her arm, and saw the shards fall below her. A second later, there was a thud as another rock hit the wall beside them. Chris was staring at the crowd furiously, and Michiko grabbed their shoulder and shook them. "Chris," she yelled, "tell me about the refugees when we're back on the top island." "Right," Chris said, snapping out of it. Drawing their sword, they cut Spider's grip, resheathed, and scrambled up the wall. Michiko leaped into the air, and the window where they had been standing shattered below them. "What is going on?" Michiko asked when Chris reached the roof where she was perched. "I always thought of Toifei as safe." Chris shook their head, dazed. "I don't know. It almost feels like... Like what?" "Like the war has spread even here."
You're listening to Born to the Blade, Episode 8, by Malka Older. Starring Exie Sands. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Born to the Blade is created by Michael R. Underwood and written by Michael R. Underwood, Marie Brennan, Cassandra Kaw, and Malka Older. It is executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.